Well, in the words of Charlotte Nichols Green, whose painting appears behind you and who was the matriarch of the family who lived in this house in 6 and 8 Chestnut Streets from 1907 to 1955, 56 or so, when she passed away. That part was all true, the next part's made up. I'm sorry I've been a hoarder, dear son John, to whom I'm leaving the house and who will then donate it to Quakers even though I don't want you to, and I tried to give it to your brother instead, but you've arranged a swap in the inheritance. I'm sorry that I was a bit of a hoarder of furniture, documents, art, and who knows what else, but hopefully the Quaker organization that is formed to accept this house that you are donating to them will find a director or two who are willing to spend the first couple of years of the nonprofit's existence just digging through and getting rid of stuff. They did.
So what was that? That was the your predecessors did all that?
Yeah, back a while back, obviously. The house was founded in 1957. Fun fact, the second director of the Friends House, their last name was Klinkenberg, and mine's Klinkenberg. No relation that I know of, but as I was reading through the house history, which we have, which a board member edited and compiled and from different sources did a bunch of interviews put together a little more than a decade ago, I thought, wait, what? Like, typo of my name, you know, the way that the mind does a double take without even, it wasn't a conscious effort, it was just, wait, what's happening? Anyway. I could go on and on about the Friends House at length, but
well, why don't we start with that? What is this place, and how did you decide to come here?
Yeah, the Beacon Hill Friends House is a few things. We are a residential intentional community of 22 adults who all live together in one big old house, and I do mean an old house built in 1805. About a half block from Boston Common in the heart of downtown Boston. We're a Quaker organization, Quakers as in the Religious Society of Friends, or religion, although most people who live here are not Quaker. We say we're a community grounded in Quaker values. There is a Quaker meeting, a congregation, that meets in our large meeting room. It's a 2-story room, spans the front to the back of the house on Sunday mornings. And we also host events and meetings, both our own programming, speakers, lectures, workshops, some film screenings, and also rent out the space on a sliding scale for nonprofits and community groups too, to all sorts of groups that are trying to do good work in the world and where having a space of this size and in this location could be useful. When we get to the philosophical discussions about social change, etc. At some point, I had an English teacher, junior year of high school. We had a substitute for 1/4 of the year, Mr. Lockery. And he was this big barrel-chested guy, pretty engaging and charismatic for high schoolers. And I remember, I think maybe on his first day, he talked about nuggets of wisdom. And that phrase stuck in my mind to this day. If he said, I'm going to distribute occasionally some nuggets of wisdom to you all, and I hope you will take them. Okay, Mr. Lockery, cool. So sometime maybe a year ago, I was thinking about things I've learned or advice that I've gotten that's good. And I was like, I should just start writing these down all over my place. Not like I'm going to catalog all of my knowledge, but, you know, there are specific pieces of insight or nuggets of wisdom, if you will, that, hey, why not write them down? There's certainly so much going on in here on a daily basis, rattling around and spilling out the edges that, you know, I'm not going to consciously keep track of them all. So I have a list of nuggets of wisdom. That's a few pages long and could run through. I'll do a couple. So things like, I got this from the Heath brothers, Chip Heath and Dan Heath, who are authors of some really great books, Made to Stick, about ideas that are sticky. How do you make ideas so they really lodge in people's minds? Switch, How to Change Things When Change is Hard. We have a book called Decisive, They have a book on the power of moments. They sort of like a pop academic type thing, but they're so engaging. They're great authors. One of them's a teacher at Stanford. And from them I get this phrase, what seems like resistance is often lack of clarity. What seems like resistance is often lack of clarity. And what, in the context of, what seems like resistance is often lack of clarity, I find that to be resonant on a personal level and on a group behavior change level as well. If there's something that I'm avoiding or I notice myself resisting, kind of not getting around to, if I have the presence of mind to step back and think, hang on, what's actually happening here? Let me consider this and take a deep breath. It's almost always true, actually, that for just myself at least, that I'm not fully clear on how to do the thing. Like maybe it's, I'm avoiding doing this thing because I don't know how to fix the roof of the house and how to get a contractor in a way that is optimally, uses our resources well and where they're going to do a good job and I won't get taken for a fool about something or whatever. Or it's, I need to ask my colleague a question, but he's out now and I'm not sure when he'll be back, and should I just send him an email? And anything where it gets to a certain cognitive level of froth that then the kind of thought trails off, it's easy to just steer another direction. And I think that's true in group behavior change too, that if people are, and actually a kind of empathetic approach we can choose to take to trying to get people to do things, which is really what a huge part of not just social change work, but maybe business also is about, and government too. It's, and thinking about user experience design, sometimes when people aren't doing something, it's not that they don't want to do it, it's just that the easiest thing is to not do it. And part of why it's easy is that there is lack of clarity about the alternative or the thing that you would like them to do.
I like that.
Yeah. That's another one. I lost it. Another one is in mediation and negotiation, the idea of separating positions from interests. So I think I first heard that at a mediation training led by the Community Dispute Settlement Center, a really great small nonprofit over in Cambridge, in a training I took maybe 8 years ago now. But that the idea that in some kind of conflict or disagreement, we often come to positions like, I need this out of this situation, and I'm staking that in the ground. And one thing that can often be helpful for a skilled mediator or negotiator to do is to separate and tease apart the stated position from the interest behind it. And there's a very simple parable that I remember they told that, yes, is very simplified and a little too cute maybe, but it illustrates the concept for me at least, where there are two people in a grocery store and they both reach for the last orange on the shelf at the same time. And they start an argument. They say, hey, I saw that first. You clearly saw me walking up. I'm like, hey, no, I reached for it first. Grabbers, keepers, whatever. And they're going back and forth and it's getting a little heated. It's like, I need the orange. No, I need the orange. I really need it. You don't understand. And someone else comes along and they say, whoa, hey, sorry, folks, but I'm notice you're arguing. Like, what's happening? And they each say, I need the orange, and this jerk is trying to take it, and I really need it. And the third person says, well, why? Can you just tell me the reason behind this? And the first one says, it's my husband's birthday, and we have this tradition that I bring him breakfast in bed with fresh squeezed orange juice, which is his favorite thing in the world. And so I really need that to make him fresh squeezed orange juice. And it's going to make his day. And we've been having a tough time. It would just mean the world to him. And the second person says, it's my child's birthday. And we've had a tough year. Their grandmother, my mother just died. And my grandmother always used to make them this orange frosted zest cake. And I need the zest of that orange to be able to make this cake recipe for their birthday party this evening. And I just really need it for that reason. And so the solution, maybe you're getting an idea, is, again, super simplified, right? But it's a nice, very simple setting. You can share the orange. One person takes the zest and the other gets to use it for the juice. Their position was, I need the orange, but the actual interest behind it was for something slightly different. And yes, that's super simplified, but I think there are extrapolatable elements of that to all sorts of things in the world where we want things and then it's easy to articulate and attach ourselves to those desires, but the motivation behind the thing is really what we want. And I mean, all sorts of psychology and other things get into that, and we could think of countless examples, but I don't have one on the tip of my mind, so I don't want to just start making up some weird metaphor. But separating positions from interests can be a powerful thing. Just in case.
So at dinner tonight, you were talking about intentional community. Could you talk about that a little bit? And there was an interesting thought that you brought up during that discussion about the architecture of a building and how that affects community.
Yeah.
So, go.
Cool. So much to say there about intentional community. The architecture piece, and maybe I can start with that because I think it's a little more specific. So the Friends house here was what is now the Beacon Hill Friends house. It's almost 14,000 square feet of building, which I didn't really have a lot of frame of reference for. I've never owned a house, but suffice it to say, that's a large house. That's a few houses of many normal-sized single-family homes in the U.S. So it was originally built as two houses side by side, and they were combined together by the then owners in the 1920s. The family owned one, bought the other one. And that means there are 2.5 stairwells, sort of. One of those has an elevator in the middle of it that was also built in 1921 or so. And there are a few different common area spaces. There's the library, which we are sitting in right now, on the second floor on one side of the house. There's the dining room, there's the kitchen, there's a kind of small lounge TV room, there's the large meeting room that has some places that might be nice to sit. There are a number of different common areas, and between the many different common areas and the many different pathways in, there are 2 front doors, there's a side door. Also between, or with it being the era of Netflix and smartphones and, I mean, even laptops, we don't even have to have it quite as recent as it is. I think in the evenings, residents are often in their rooms by themselves, or if you're passing someone, there's not just one hallway you pass. Maybe on a freshman dorm, or at least my freshman dorm in college, there was one hallway that all the rooms were on, and you could hear the doors a little bit opening and closing, and there was one common room. Here, there are many other options, which is a great blessing in many ways, and it doesn't feel like, even though you're living with 21 other people, that you're all on top of each other. But it does mean we're distributed around the house. Oh, also, by the way, we live in downtown Boston, and there are plenty of things to do outside the house, even in the winter, in the middle of February, like it is now. And I think all that adds up to rooms often feel sparse, or I don't think it's bad, but it's not exactly the image I had of a community house before I moved in here, or then it's not exactly like some other group houses I lived in the past, where there was a central living room that really was the collective space, or like some even single-family homes. Different families have different cultures around this that I think is partially influenced by the architecture of the home and other factors. But do people spend time in their rooms, or do people spend time in the living room or around the kitchen/dining room table? I always did, in high school, I did my homework at the dining table. I didn't do it in my room. It was partially my room was often a little colder. It was partially just, I don't know, habit, and that's what we happened to do. And the architecture of, and not just architecture or design in the sort of high design conceptual sense, but just the physical, the way that rooms are structured together and hallways and connections, I think, does shape then human behavior. That's not that profound a statement, but I notice it living in this house, especially comparing it to other houses. And maybe I notice it a little bit more bringing a lens of intentional community, because that is something that we talk about here and that this place is explicitly about, is living together under one roof. It's not just a boarding house. It's not a place where you can be ships passing in the night and never see some of your roommates, whether you're the one who's never there or whether that guy on the third floor, what's his name again, Joe, who's never there. This is a place that is meant for, and is, I mean, we select for this when we interview applicants, we being the residency committee, it's not just me. We look for people who want to live in a place like this and are interested and willing to make the commitment to be at house dinner on average at least 3 out of 5 nights each week, which is the expectation we set. We have a shared meal 5 nights a week. And it is we don't want this to be a place, I don't want at least to be a place where you're supposed to be at dinner every night and it's weird if you're not. It's 2019, maybe that's relevant too, but people have modern busy lives and that should be the case. I think this is place is at its best when it is a place where people are normal in the sense of out in the world and doing things, and you can feel free to live your life and be an autonomous individual in that. And you're also anchored in some ways to community and to this community in specific ways and times, like house dinner, like house meeting every 2 weeks where we all sit around in this room in the library on this couch and others on the chairs and spend 2 hours together. And there's an agenda and someone is facilitating the meeting and it doesn't feel overly formal. It's a relaxed time. We set up a tea service over there and people have herbal tea, and sometimes there's a unexpected dessert snack in the middle during a break. But I've kind of transitioned now to talking about intentional community, I guess, in the house. I got there from the way that physical space shapes the way people behave and the way that manifests or relates to a community being intentional or not and what that means.
So why live in an intentional community? Why do people do this? Why? Why do people come here?
I think that's a great question, and I like the phrasing of I don't think of myself as a salesman for intentional community. So why intentional community? But I think that a great way to answer that is because it happens and people do want to live here, and in all sorts of other co-ops by name and not name, cooperative houses and just community place, and live in community in all sorts of venues. Why do people want that? From my own experience and from what I've seen, things that attract people here include that modern life can be kind of lonely, not just in cities, but there is a certain loneliness, or there can be, about urban life. I think cities tend to attract people. They attract families, certainly, but they also attract a lot of people who are leaving their home and coming to a place for opportunity around work or education or lifestyle or some combination thereof. And anytime you move to a new place where you don't know people, or even if you know some people, that can be hard and that can be lonely and isolating even when you're surrounded by hundreds of thousands of people. And one attraction of a place like the Beacon Hill Friends House is a chance to immerse yourself immediately, not just in some people who happen to be living under the same roof, but in a group that on some level at least self-identifies, or where the people self-identify also as, they have self-selected in as, yes, I also want to be living in a place where I have strong relationships with the people I live with, and to the point where we call it a community, not just a house, where we share dinner, where we share house meeting, where we share responsibility for chores, and it's not just my right to be an asshole roommate and not do my chore, that there's a different ethos or mentality around what it means to live here, and that it is not a privilege in the sense of, oh, we are the organization and doing you a huge favor by letting you live here, but that there is an aspect of commitment in really living in community in a way that again, I use the phrase intentional community. You could say committed community. That's a little different than the alternative. And that's also not to say that someone who just lives in a group house but doesn't call it an intentional community or doesn't call it a cooperative isn't living in community or having a great time or having the balance that works great for them of time with others and time on their own getting to recharge, right? Not to say that at all, but there is still this flavor and this shared collective naming that is different. And it doesn't just apply to living situations, I think. I think there is something different about communities where certain things are made explicit and sort of part of the admission or part of the ground rules in coming there is named explicitly, and so then you know something about other people there going in. That's similar to the way that you and I met, the StartingBloc Fellowship in some ways actually too, that in the fellowship or in the fellow community, you don't know someone you're just meeting for the first time who's a StartingBloc fellow who went through a different 5-day institute, which is the onboarding to the fellowship. But you might know a few things about them, or at least you can make a guess that is less likely to be wrong by the fact that they also self-selected in to this fellowship that is about the future of leadership and social innovation and maybe social entrepreneurship if they joined pre-2009 and that was the language they were using a little bit more. And there's such a broad range within that of what people are working on, but there are certain common elements then, and you can feel some greater connection right off the bat before meeting anyone, which then changes the way that you show up and changes the way that other people show up more ready for connection. In a way, it's maybe even like, I've sometimes thought this may seem like an out there or less related, but there's a connection in my head. If you see someone wearing a t-shirt of your favorite band, what do you know about them other than that they bought or were given or happen to be wearing also a shirt of that? You don't know anything except that, but that's often enough to spark connection and to spark a conversation. And I think people often are looking for more connection. Like no matter whether you're an introvert or extrovert, we are social creatures at our core. We evolved as a species by collaborating and using the power of language and other forms of communication, body language and dance and other things too, but especially language, right? And we evolved in community and in groups working together. And I think at some root level, there's this desire to connect and to be seen and understood by others, and having some spark helps that connection, whether it's that I see you have a Magic the Gathering t-shirt and I also love Magic the Gathering, or whether it's that I see on your LinkedIn page that you also went to the University of Michigan and I went to the University of Michigan, or whether it's that you're a Quaker and I'm a Quaker, even if we might have vastly different theological beliefs as part of that, or non-theological beliefs even, as in there are non-theist Quakers. Some spark of connection, just like seeding the, nucleating, something to nucleate around, I think is really powerful and comes up in all sorts of communities, and it may be a common element across most, if not all, the communities that I've been a part of, is they give some way for, there's some platform or spark that helps people connect in a way that is stronger or happens more readily than would happen between strangers. That's a long paragraph.
I like it.
Do you know the comedian Reggie Watts?
Sounds familiar.
He's a black guy. He has poofy hair. I really don't know what his accent is, so which is how I might guess where he's from, because I've seen him twice. Once at a TEDx event in DC, TEDx Mid-Atlantic, and once somewhere else I forget, but also in DC. And and I've seen videos of his online, and he started with this, classic American, I'm not that great at just distinguishing between different British or Commonwealth nation accents, but I think some kind of British accent. And halfway through, he switched to a sort of southern part of the US accent. And both sounded so authentic, and he kept them up for so long, and I really don't know. And I could look that up, but it's kind of more fun even that I just haven't remembered to, and it's kind of fun to have the mystery still there. But I found him very funny. One particular shtick that is why he came to mind is he started at one point in British accent mode opining, or orating, I guess I should say is a better word. Yeah. Reggie Watts started talking about how in the course of human events, it happens from time to time that we see happenstance and circumstances change that cause us to consider whether it is really true that together people shall, or in some cases shall not, do things that they are really not sure will become, or may not become for that matter, the things to which they wish they had applied themselves further in the past. For example, in pursuing a journey across a long distance, or nay, even a short distance, a journey of any type or time or place or matter, no matter what the mechanism, by boat, by plane, by horse, by bicycle, accompanied by companions, or on one's own, the journey that they carry shall, whether or not they know it be a journey at the same time, whether or not they are using flowery language like I am without meaning to, or whether they are talking in plain speech, they encounter along the way certain aspects that may or may not, it really varies, become things that they had not anticipated would be part of their never-ending quest and experience along the way as they undertake and undergo the actions and the cognitive responses and emotional reactions to the events that they encounter along the way. And he just kept on going in a never-ending sentence, and you're like, it took a little while to realize, wait, what is the point he's getting to? Wait, I really lost. Wait, oh, this is the joke. And he went on for about 5 minutes, and I loved it. And I mentioned it, I kind of did that to my spouse the other day, and she said, oh, I hate it. And I was like, oh yeah, you would kind of have gotten sick of that. And I thought it was brilliant.
Cool.
He also did a thing, Reggie Watts, where he said, and now I would like to outline a few things for you. Physically outline it. So like slapstick puns like that, but with a physicality to it.
Yeah.
It's good.
I'm going to stop and start. Cool. When you were talking earlier, I heard something that maybe I was just re-noticing, but that community and communication have the same root. And it got me thinking about some of the serendipity that happens in StartingBloc, and I'm sure there's some of that here as well. I wonder if you have any thoughts on the serendipity of communities, of intentional communities, or of StartingBloc, or just thinking about how ideas and people and life kind of comes together.
Yeah. So I think there's a serendipity of community, certainly in just when you have a critical mass of people in one place encountering another more, there are more interactions happening, more idea sparks, that sort of thing. And I think the more that there is diversity across different dimensions, there's a richness there of ideas and of backgrounds and of worldviews and mental frames and models that furthers that, which is one of the many arguments for, or if you want to have a business case for increasing diversity and inclusion, that's not even top of the list, but that's one of the many benefits for those who need to have a financial analysis or something, and a cost-benefit aspect of not having all the same type of people in the room with the same backgrounds and the same thinking styles. And I know there's been, I don't know, I haven't studied this. I've heard that named as a trend in design of business spaces of, let's try and design the common space so that it sparks interaction more between people, and we don't have separate water coolers, but there's the whole kitchen area where then it sparks interactions between the designers and the engineers. Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm sure that happens here at the friend's house and at StartingBloc and anywhere else. There is also value in affinity spaces, I will say, of having groups and settings for people who are all, say, for the example of StartingBloc, you might have people working in the nonprofit sector, for profit, want to do CSR in a giant corporation, are starting a small nonprofit, are working in government innovation, don't know what they want to do, want to really delve into spirituality and contemplative practice and anti-trauma healing, all under one roof, so to speak, roof for the 5 days of the conference and joining the fellowship, and then in the fellow community, alumni of that 5-day program. There is also value of bringing together people who are trying to start nonprofits working on clean energy or whatever it is, right? So there is a value for spaces like that too. I don't want to diminish that at all, but I think there is a value for having diversity still with some common frame and common theme, whether it's social innovation or whether it's justice in leadership or whatever the frame is, whether it's living communally aligned with Quaker values and deepening in sort of what I think of as the personal/spiritual dimension. And I say that because for some people, the language of spirituality is very resonant and very meaningful for them, for a lot of people. And there are some people for whom it is not, and who are even turned off by that, but who I think stand equally to gain from many of the same practices and approaches, whether it's contemplative practice and not just things that Quakers do of like sitting silently and meeting, and whether it's meditating or opening to yourself to listen to the spirit or whatever language someone would want to use. One person, I guess, without making light of or diminishing the value of spiritual deepening or spiritual formation, I think in some sense it can be true that one person's spiritual deepening is what another person might call personal deepening, or call something else entirely, but still be, if not the same thing, because each of us is unique as an individual, very similar and involve a lot of the same attributes of knowing oneself more deeply, growing into alignment and living with more alignment with one's values, living with integrity, and which I heard expressed once as, am I going to remember this right? Living with integrity is saying what you think and doing what you say, something like that. So where were we? Thinking about the serendipity of community, and which maybe is part of a broader topic of what happens in community, broadly speaking, when people are in communion, in community with each other. I don't mean a community like a municipality and we say, oh, the community of Marblehead, Massachusetts, or whatever town, right? Like a community of people who know each other in some way, and hopefully are knowing and are getting to know each other more as time passes in that community. More actually than serendipity of community, one thing I've been thinking about a lot recently is the things that can happen in community that can't happen otherwise, or that don't happen otherwise. I could put that better. But so rather than serendipity of community, I'm thinking about the ways that people grow and can feel supported and open to exploring and growing and changing with a critical mass of people around them, or that they're in relationship with, who are supporting them in that. And I can say more about what I mean by that. Some of it aligns, or kind of mentally rhymes, I might say, with that Margaret Mead quote about never underestimate the power of a small group of committed people to change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And I think there's a lot to that, as much as that's in certain circles that's widely quoted, and I'm like, oh yeah, that quote. But that's pretty profound too. It's both, and I think a lot of things that are simple are or that are profound are simple too, or that it's really hard to try to change systems or to challenge ways of thinking, to challenge organizations or entities or injustices or any sort of thing on your own. And that's not just because you only have 24 hours in a day and you're one person and you need to sleep and eat and rest a little in that time too. It's hard when the world around us is saying one thing, and a lot of that's implicit, right, through a culture, and we all have nested communities and nested cultures, but when our cultures and the world around us is saying one thing and we have some feeling or thought, hey, maybe this could be different. Again, as social creatures and people as humans who evolved to live or die based on ability to get along with others for a large portion of our evolutionary history, I'm not an evolutionary scientist, right? So I don't want to get too deep into it because of how we evolved this. But it makes sense that, and I think, certainly resonates with my own experience, social pressure is a really strong phenomenon for most people. And if everyone you know is saying one thing and you believe another, maybe you're wrong, right? If everyone's like, hey, there's a tiger coming, run the other direction, and you're like, no, I don't believe in tigers, and there is a tiger, you know what? You don't survive to have fertile offspring, right? Like, you get eaten or mauled. So there is a lot of that. Like, it makes sense to go along with the tribe and with the herd, but it does mean that innovators, those who, reformers, those who would challenge a system, have a lot of not just social work to do, sort of, not in the social work sense, but psychological inner work to do, or at least need a lot of fortitude to stand up against, even if no one is actively saying, hey, Joe, your idea is bad and it won't work. Still, if everyone is operating in another direction or moving in the other way, it takes a lot to move against the current. And one of the really powerful things about community and about finding others who are aligned with you in whatever dimension it is that you feel less lonely in doing that work. And it doesn't have to be exactly the same. Like, no one at the friend's house, partially because I'm the executive director here, but no one has the same job that I do. No one has the same work history. No one is trying to do the exact same things in the world. The same is true at StartingBloc. And even when I used to work at an environmental consulting firm, mostly doing work for the EPA, no one I knew had exactly the same experience or interests, or, well, I'm working on energy efficiency, but I'm also really interested in corporate sustainability and in when groups of organizations come together to unlock system value that benefits a third party, so the net benefit is there, but the person who holds the key doesn't directly benefit. Like, no one's working on that exactly, but having people who are generally aligned and who are even just aligned around working to change systems for the better is, I think, a really powerful and motivating and fortifying force. And you and I have never worked on the same project together. We've never worked in exactly the same part of the environmental field, but knowing that, like, being friends with each other, not just people who know each other and are friends, but who share this culture that we have in StartingBloc of it's worth it to do the hard work to challenge the systems to work for a better world that we believe is possible. Even though we're working on different things, the fact that we are in community together makes it at least a little bit easier and makes us, I think, then at least a little bit more likely to be successful in our work. And that is part of the core value of spaces like StartingBloc, of communities like StartingBloc, which by no means is the only supportive community for social changemakers, but is a really powerful one that I joined in March of 2011 and have had a really great time spending a lot of time in since.
So what do you think about the notion of you described tribes, right? And you described communities, and you used an example of, I forget where the place was, but uh, uh, kind of discounting the geographic community as a real community. Like when I go back to suburbia in Virginia, um, I don't talk to my neighbors the way I talk to StartingBloc fellows, and I didn't enjoy dinner with them the way I enjoyed dinner at the friend's house. And so, I don't know. What do you think about uh, the way communities are, and the way maybe they could be if they mimicked tribes like StartingBloc, or real communities like the Friends House?
Interesting question. So a few things there. One is, I didn't mean to discount geographic community. I would call the Friends House a geographic community that exists within the bounds of number 6 and number 8 Chestnut Street in Boston, Massachusetts, 02108, and has members in sort of nested communities outside, like our alumni, our board members, our friends of residents who come to dinner often, right? There are, all these nested levels, and it's not always a hard boundary. But I think one big difference in the use of community as, whether geographic or not, actually, like the community of, the academic community, right? We use the term community sometimes, or modern American English, right, uses this term in a way to mean something different. So I just meant that, like, that is not a community in the sense that, I don't know, that a group of friends who go out for drinks every Thursday is a community, right? Or friends from college who keep in touch in a WhatsApp group, or whatever it is, right? And part of it, I think a big part is just scale and size. And many things are scalable, and there are nested levels of complexity, and humanity has achieved some really remarkably high ones. Like, anytime I'm in New York City, I am just astonished at the scale of it and how it works, and just the levels of complexity that things are managed. Like, I passed a giant garage, and it was just the garage for, I think, one type of New York City Department of Sanitation truck has this vast garage that is, how is that managed? It's an organization in itself, and it's all these nested systems, and it boggles the mind a little bit, which actually gets at the point I wanted to make, that this boggling of the mind, we can keep growing scale in certain ways, but there's something that is not scaling in that, which is the human brain. And certain things get, like, the human brain is amazing, including in its elasticity and extensibility throughout our lifetimes. As far as I understand, the science has increasingly learned that old dogs can learn new tricks in this sense. But there are limits to complexity. Just like human cognitive capacity has bounds, I guess. Not saying y'all are dumb, people, humans on Earth, or we all are dumb. But I've heard estimates of, someone calculated the number of bits per second that the human brain can process. That's one way to measure it. Like a computer can process bits of information. Someone calculated that, and it's roughly about equivalent to the amount of information in 2 people speaking simultaneously at you. And if you think about it, if you've ever tried to listen to 2 people speaking at once, it really strains the brain, and you can kind of get snippets. And maybe if you're really feeling like your brain is turned on, you're engaged, they're speaking clearly and maybe slowly enough, or the subject matter, it's not super unexpected, you can kind of catch both. But you can't do 3. And even 2, you're losing some. There are limits to the brain's ability to comprehend information. And it's not just about flow in, but also, I think, just about eventually, it's finite. It's one of the most miraculous things that we know of in the universe, the thing inside this thin layer of hair and skin and bone. But it still has finite limits. And that relates to knowing people as well. And there's a phenomenon, or a concept called Dunbar's number, which you can look up the Wikipedia entry for, which is the idea that people can only know, like really know as you know another person, not have a number of Facebook friends as some limited number of people, after which it kind of tails off. Like you can have met them, you can know their name, but you really can't know. There just isn't space in your brain to know them and to know them in an updated way where you know about their life. How are you doing? Like I see you every year and a half or so, Joe. You know, and even then, like Dunbar's number, the estimates, according to my exhaustive research on Wikipedia and seeing it referenced in other books over time, about on the order of 150 people. Maybe it's 100, maybe it's 300. Probably depends on the individual. It depends on how deep you know them and all that. But no matter how many Facebook friends you have, or I don't know, people you follow on Instagram or whatever social media analogy, Generation Z, how many people you snap with. No matter how many that is, at some point there is a limit and it kind of drops off the edge afterwards, right? That has vast implications for community and for the scale at which it is possible to know others and to be in community with them in different senses of community. That doesn't mean that we can't feel affinity and fellowship with people on a much broader scale. I think we can. I think that's actually really important to cultivate, and maybe even important for the survival of the human race, not to get too grandiose about it, but to cultivate more of a sense of in-group affiliation and I am on the same team as with all of humanity, maybe even with life on Earth more broadly, because to some extent we are all in this together on this one planet we have here. And even if we succeed in setting up civilization on Mars, that's still only 2 planets, bro. So the challenge of Dunbar's number and that kind of concept is, when it comes to community, is there are only so many people you can know so well. And I don't think there's a right answer then of the questions to the questions that lead directly from that of, okay, well, what's the best way to live my life to feel in community, but also be reaching out into the world and getting ideas and influencing others, right? Maybe I don't even know what the question would be, but like, what's the right number, or the optimal number of best friends to have, right? Like, how many people should I invite to my wedding? This comes up, obviously those like maybe aren't direct questions that people lose sleep over, or have other answers that present themselves readily to, but I've found it a challenge in the past, I guess in my adult life so far, of how to stay connected with people I like and really love and clicked with, felt incredibly emotionally bonded with, have had incredible deep conversations with, and felt like this is my intellectual partner here. And like many young educated people, or people, been very fortunate to get to travel, to be part of communities and in settings forming community in lots of different places, including at over 20 StartingBloc institutes now, and my volunteer roles going back and helping facilitate each 5-day conference and bringing in new classes of fellows. And you form really strong community, and then it disperses. And maybe you keep in touch with a couple, but after a certain point, you can't keep doing that without having sort of like 10 in the bed and the little one said, roll over, because your new StartingBloc fellow friends from the new institute, or you moved cities and your new friends there, some things have to give. And I don't know, this could lead into a whole discussion musing on ending of things and loss and death, and completion is a term that I really like, that I've been thinking about and I could go into more depth on. But communities and friendships and groups, if we are expanding and changing over time, other things are closing and dying. We could make an ecological analogy here too, right? That trees are beautiful, blossoms are incredible, and they don't last forever. And a thriving cherry tree, to borrow a metaphor that what's his name used in a book? Michael Braungart and the architect
Bill McDonough.
that Bill McDonough used, and Bill McDonough and Michael Braungart used in Cradle to Cradle, they said, no one looks at a cherry tree and thinks, in blossom in the spring, and thinks, what a waste. How many blossoms does it take? Most of those aren't going to grow up into new trees. We don't say that. We say, oh, what a thing of beauty. And we understand the biological cycle, and also that it's totally fine because the cycle isn't that each blossom needs to become a new cherry tree. It's that some might become, cherries with seeds inside that then land in soil and have the right conditions and end up in the right situation to become new trees. And some become compost, essentially. And this could be taken out of context as Nils says, ditch your compostable friends and only keep the cherry blossom ones. But I think on some level, it happens whether or not we do it purposely, right? Either, and some people do this, like no new friends. Right? Hey, I have enough, meet new people, but honestly, no, I'm pretty good. And I think that's great. That's fine for people to do. And it's a choice, or maybe it's not a choice for some, but it just sort of happens. That's one way to live one's life through community. Or you can be constantly networking and meeting new people and all that and swinging from relationship to relationship. And that's another way to live. I don't think there's any, at least I don't hold any feeling of moral, guidance or right and wrong around that, but they are choices that either we make or happen to us, like a lot of things in life. And the scale of community is just one tricky aspect of it, that I think communities last for a certain amount of time. This community of people who live in a friend's house right now exists for a while, since people can only live here up to 4 years and then have to move on at some point. Some will, and then it's a slightly different community. Like at a 5-day StartingBloc Institute, oftentimes you make some really strong connections with other people there. Maybe even you feel a sense of affinity and connection to the group of 80 other people as a whole, not that you've gotten to meet all of them in only 5 days. And that's special and real. And then at the end, that's the last time that you will all be in that same room, in any room actually, together ever again, and that's okay. One of my housemates in DC would say that her favorite genre of movie was specific time travel romantic comedy, which there are not that many of, but there are a few. The Time Traveler's Wife, I think, is one. About Time, is you were just saying, yes. I feel like I've seen ads occasionally for others, but very specific genre. But she knew what she liked, and she liked time travel romantic comedies.
I like those too.
Cool. Grab a party sometime.
So I had a thought about what you were saying about scaling community and thinking about Dunbar's number. And then maybe this is a good transition to some of the sustainability stuff. But I heard a legislator say, he was describing, he first started describing transportation projects and how at this point they're kind of horse trading. And it's basically like, you make a political deal to get a transportation funding for your district. And he was saying on the topic of climate change that it seems almost impossible to get everybody on the same page in a legislature of, whatever it is, 140, 160 people, let alone at the national level of 535 plus the executive branch. And then combining that with what you were saying, and also these perhaps overly used quotes like the Margaret Mead one about small group of people
yeah.
and like think global, act local. Do you think, or I guess, what do you think about that and the notion that we can't do anything at a certain scale?
Fascinating.
And maybe we are only effective really at a community level.
I think on some level it's just It's obviously not true because we have seen examples of planet scale and national scale collaboration beforehand on plenty of things. Trade agreements, the Montreal Protocol, which is one of the most successful international environmental legislations that helped heal the hole in the ozone layer, or healed the hole, led to the over time natural processes being allowed to then bring back the ozone layer near the poles. Plenty of other examples of collaboration. I do think it's a fascinating question tying in or making the querying around the connection between the size of a legislature or a decision-making body and Dunbar's number, for example, this 150-ish approximately, maybe it's 100, maybe it's 500 people that it is possible to know maximum number before things fall off the edge and you really just can't keep in your brain, you just can't know people. There's in the time of the day. Maybe things like LinkedIn actually help for that too, and other database type things. I can imagine in some future heads-up display where we walk up and just surreptitiously pops up in my vision, field of vision only. It's like, Joe Plummer, you met at StartingBloc in Boston in June of 2012. Likes bananas. Doesn't like whatever. Like, oh, hey, Joe, how's it going? Like, oh, how are your kids? Hannah and Mary. Like, just sort of prompting. That allows me to then know 1,000 people in a different level through computer assistance, sort of. But anyway, that aside, there's still some limit, even if it's not a hard number. And I don't know, I haven't considered this. I'm sure there are theorists and researchers working in the fields of governance and decision-making that have thought about these things. It does seem to me it would probably be different. It matters what the form of decision-making is. Is this majority wins? Is this a parliamentary system where you need to have a plurality coalition, or and like your plurality party can be the ruling party if you're in coalition with others? Is it consensus? Goodness help you. Is it Quaker decision-making process, which is not consensus? It is about sense of the meeting. The meeting being the body of people who are making a decision together. And that's a subtle difference that some people who have heard of, oh yeah, Quakers, they do things by consensus. I mean, it's more consensus than anything else that's common, but it is distinct and importantly different, I would say. In pure consensus, taken at least one way, it means that everyone has to agree, which is often really hard, especially if you get a bunch of people in and it's something that people have emotions at all about and care about. Sense of the meeting is everyone in the room, at its best, and when it works right, everyone in the room is listening for what is the right outcome for the group. And the way Quakers have traditionally done business, in a sense of not done transactions, but made decisions about things as groups, whether it's where to invest our money, whether it's where do we build a new meeting house, whether it's should this person be allowed to officially be a member of our community and be approved, whatever it is. There's this, someone will be facilitating the meeting. They're called the clerk for whatever historical reason. And the clerk is ideally, they are setting aside, it's not that they don't have opinions, but that's not the role they're there to play, to offer their opinion or to dominate especially. It's to listen to the group, to solicit feedback and people sharing their thoughts. It's to ask for other opinions. It's to affirm what's said. It's to synthesize and balance and hear where things are going. It's to ask for moments or periods of silence when it seems like things are getting heated or just for any other reason that the group could use a little waiting. And that can lead to that sort of listening, which Quakers who are, depending on one's worldview around religion and God, might say they're listening for the will of God in the room, or might just say, I personally am on the, what you call the non-theist end of the Quaker spectrum, I guess. and I don't believe in, based on the evidence with which I've been presented, and my experience and my understanding of psychology and all sorts of things, and how our minds work and recognize patterns, I don't believe in the idea of a God type entity. That doesn't make sense with how evidence works and how all other knowledge that we've gotten as humans works. But I think there is really something very powerful in this listening, not to what an external force or entity or being is saying, but in some ways analogous to, or might even in practice be the same as someone who I've heard people say, like, God only acts through our hands, which is even as a non-theist, I like that idea of like that parable, the story of floodwaters are rising and there's a guy in his house and people are like, hey, dude, come on, get out. He's like, nope, I'm very faithful. God will provide. They're like, come on, it's the last Jeep. Like, the floodwaters are here. He's like, nope, I'm going to wait. God will provide. And then the floodwaters keep rising and he's up in the second floor of his house and someone goes to buy in a boat and they're like, Joe, come on, like, get in the boat. Like, we got to see. He's like, no, I've been praying to God. Like, going to save me in my home here. I've been praying about this. God will provide. I have deep faith. Like, my faith is unshakable. So, nope. And then floodwaters keep rising. He's up on the roof. He's struggling. And people in a helicopter say, come on, Joe, like, last hit. Let's go. It's like, no, God will provide. I'm not going. Deeply faithful in this. I'm not giving up. And the floodwaters rise more. And he's standing on his chimney. And they're rising. Floodwaters are rising. And he's starting to get swept away. And he calls out to God and prays and says, Lord, why have you forsaken me? I have always been so faithful to you, and I've put all my faith in you here. And God says back to him, I sent a Jeep and a boat and a helicopter. Like, what sign do you want? What are you waiting for? And maybe it sounds tongue-in-cheek coming from someone who doesn't believe in God, but there's still even a poignance in that story to me of this idea that I've heard expressed as, God's only hands are our hands, and then it's kind of, it almost doesn't matter whether you believe that a decision or a discernment in the group is divinely inspired because the divine exists in that way, or it's divinely inspired as a metaphor, or whether the phrase divinely inspired makes you uncomfortable because people would assume things about your thinking that isn't true. Then there still is I think it's really powerful, this kind of listening to the group. And it's not just listening for what do I think should happen. It's both listening to what is being said and listening for what is the right decision for this group to make together. And I will note this is a process being done in community, right? These are people who not necessarily know each other all super well, but there is some commitment to caring about the outcome and caring that the outcome is something good for the group. And I have been in meetings for business where it seemed like things were going one way. The answer seemed obvious for this question at the beginning. Some comments were made. Yep, cool, trending. And someone makes a point. Or maybe it's a point of concern or in opposition to, and brings up something. And the group sits with that and more comes out. And I have seen things shift completely and outcomes that were not on the table before, or that didn't seem at all within the realm of likelihood, that this patient, quiet, maybe calm, but not necessarily even, I wouldn't necessarily use the word calm in all cases. It sometimes feels calm, but it might be heated even and full of energy and fervor. But with a guide, the clerk facilitating and guiding this process, and it's not the clerk's role alone to do this discernment, right? It's at its best, again, it's everyone in the room along with the clerk listening for what is the right answer, what is the right decision for this group to make. And sometimes that means even individuals noticing or saying, hey, I still believe this other thing, But what we're doing here is trying to find out what's right for the group, and the sense of the meeting, which is the phrase that's used. I get that the sense of the meeting isn't what I would personally do, and so I'm willing to go along with that. And that's actually pretty common. It's also sometimes common for individuals to ask to stand aside from a decision, and sometimes then that's written in the notes or the minutes of the meeting is friends approved. Sometimes historical language just is like fun to use still, so they'll say that, like, Quakers are fine being called Quakers, by the way, or capital F friend, but people in the room, friends. So friends approved donating $3,000 instead of our usual $1,000 to whatever organization it is, with two friends standing aside from this decision. Cool. And maybe it took 5 times as long as a majority vote would have. And maybe it was the thing that you thought was going to happen in the beginning. Maybe it was not. But there's a buy-in that happens, and this is not unique to Quaker process at all, right? But when people are part of a decision-making process, this is part of the selling point of democracy, I think, too, right? That if it's done well and if people actually feel like a voting process or whatever, however the democracy society works, if people feel buy-in to how decisions are made, it is much easier to go along with them and to actually help carry those out, too. If you have a boss who tells you this is what we're going to do and you disagree with it, and the boss doesn't ask for your opinion, or you try to give it and the boss says, I don't want to hear it, I've already decided, even if you really love your paycheck and benefits and all that, it's going to be a lot harder to carry that out than if your boss listened to you and said, hey, I hear you. Here is what I am hearing you say. I am still going to decide this other thing, and the rules of the system that we are in this company or in this organization, whatever, is maybe it's I'm the boss and I say so, or maybe it's, hey, I'll take that to the executive committee and then it decides, like, whatever it is, it doesn't matter that, but the point being, if you feel heard and like, hey, Joe, this is what I hear you saying, and I disagree, and I'm still going to carry out this policy in a different way, but I hear you, I think it's easier for people in that situation, like the you in this situation, to go along with that decision and to even help carry it out if you know what's behind it. If the boss is also, if the boss has said, hey, this is why I'm making that decision, then if it's just no, or sorry, you got 49%, you lose. Man, I'm not made for TV. Like, my sound bites are 6 minutes long, which is
that's great. I think that's really good, actually. You get deeper in conversation when you go past the social media soundbite.
Can I tell you what I think is the core innovation of StartingBloc?
Yes.
Cool. It took me a while to, not like I was seeking, what is the core innovation of StartingBloc, of the StartingBloc Fellowship, but kind of stumbled into it. But I believe that the core innovation of what StartingBloc does is, so it started 2004-ish. I think the organization started 2003, Institute was 2004 or 5. Anyway, roughly then, with a couple weekend-long events. And at some point, I don't know the exact chronology, they decided to call it an institute, and it was over a few weekends, and then at some point it was combined, and they just did this long weekend, Thursday to Monday model, which is what it still is now. And you could have a 5-day conference full of amazing speakers, really insightful, top of their game, professionals working on stuff, doing amazing innovative work, get the best people in the room to attend and hear all this content, the youngest, the brightest, or not even young people, and they'd make some connection and then go out into the world, and that would be that.
I'm not just awkwardly leaning behind you.
Okay.
I am kind of, but I'm going to be right back. It's okay to I come in and out, or we're having a private meeting?
We're filming. So we're going to retake this one.
That was awkward.
It's okay. We didn't have a sign or anything.
How long will you? I'm just going to put this outside here.
Perfect. I'll bring it back in.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. I'm going to make an X. So am I screwing up all your filming right now?
No.
The entire movie.
It's like the 4 minutes.
One take.
I'm just gonna...
You want to start that over?
Sure.
So the core innovation of StartingBloc.
So, Joe, the core innovation of StartingBloc. It's not like I was seeking this out as what is the core innovation, but I kind of stumbled into it. And I believe the core innovation of StartingBloc is...
I'm so sorry.
Take 3. So, the core innovation of StartingBloc. It's not like I was seeking, what is this? I can't figure it out. But just kind of stumbled into, at some point, what I think is maybe the core innovation of the StartingBloc Fellowship. So it started back in 2004-ish, depending on how you count, 2003, 2005. Events bringing together people interested in social enterprise, social entrepreneurship, social business for maybe a weekend, or then a couple weekends. And then the framing of social impact and social innovation, and then settled on this format of Thursday to Monday long weekend, which the format still is today. So you could have a 5-day conference with the best, most accomplished, excellent and eloquent speakers in whatever topic it is about, and bring in the most hotshot, fast-growing, exciting, full of promise professionals and others, or whoever you want in the room to attend, the most promising, whoever they are, high potential, for a 5-day conference of all that great content. And at the end of it, it can easily be then a cool thing that you did once. And, oh yeah, I learned a ton. It was great. And, oh, I made some great connections. Yeah, I'm kind of in touch with a couple people. What StartingBloc does is, rather than spend a huge amount of that time on just the content, and then maybe there's a happy hour reception or something at the end of the day, or maybe there's lunch and you kind of sit with your colleagues or people you already know, or maybe you're doing the networking thing, giving out lots of business cards. At a StartingBloc Institute, if you think of slider bars, or sort of in the pie chart maybe of like this percentage, I can't do, okay, that's a bad way, rather than most of it being about really great content, StartingBloc shifts that down. There's still a lot of great content. There are some frameworks, there's some learning, there's common setting of, there's real content there, and a lot of the time is spent on relationship building, on shared norms and culture, not in a way of, now we will discuss the shared norms and culture of StartingBloc, but in an experiential way of through interactive, Scott Sherman or Kaveh or Michael Williams, I forget Kave's last name, or Michael Williams presenting the Transformative Action Institute's curriculum around how social change actually happens, but doing that in this really fun way. It involves like dancing. If you don't like dancing, don't be put off. You wouldn't even know it's going to happen. And then when it happens, you don't even notice it's happening because it's by a really engaging speaker. It's by building it's shared experiences, sharing norms and culture and values, and just a lot of relationship building, so that by the end of the 5 days, with, again, some great content, some great learning, by the end of 5 days, there's this really strong lattice of connection that serves as a platform upon which further learning can happen. And it's not that every single person who goes through a StartingBloc Institute meets 10 best friends and 10 roll over in the bed out of their Dunbar number of community connections. But for many people who have gone through the fellowship and who go through, there is this, it feels very different. It's not just a conference, right? It's this community norming building experience where then afterwards, bilaterally in, as I term it, like one-on-one relationships, and in Facebook groups and WhatsApps and whatever else, other ways that you connect with other fellows, there's all this learning that can happen on top of it on a foundation of shared trust and shared experience and some shared cultural norms, like we were talking about earlier, of, oh, this person went through StartingBloc and the fact that they're still engaged and still on the Facebook group or still coming back to this later institute or to this StartingBloc boot camp or in a StartingBloc learning circle or whatever it is, I've even met the person that says to me that they're probably, or at least there's a much better chance that they care about making the world a better place, are interested in innovating in doing that, not innovation for innovation's sake, but in like, hey, this is hard and a lot of things haven't worked, and so what are best practices? How can we do that? That they're interested in community and in doing this work together with others, because it's really lonely to try and change things in general, systems of all types, that they might be willing to go deep fast and cut the crap and just the small talk, and hey, if we're going to bother to do this, let's really get real, not in a, hey, nice to meet you, tell me your deepest fear and what are you most embarrassed about, but in a strong connecting way. In like, we are primed then, not to speak for all StartingBloc fellows, but I think there is some kind of priming for connection and relationship and excitement about, hey, let's be connected and be in more community and figure out how to do some good stuff and make the world better. And I think that's the core innovation of StartingBloc, is spending time up front-loading that relationship building and connection aspect, so that then so much more learning and real work can happen afterwards. So for me, StartingBloc is not a thing that I did for 5 days back in March of 2011. It's a thing that I am a part of, and I continue to learn from.
So we started to have this conversation, I don't know, a few nights ago. But what do you think about the notion of a multi-generational StartingBloc community? And if you talk about 2003, 2005 as kind of the genesis of StartingBloc, and so that would make StartingBloc as an organization or as a thing 15, 20
years old, yeah.
So I guess what I'm curious about is, what does StartingBloc look like in 100 years?
Whoa.
Yeah, and what if we decided to build something that we knew was going to take 100 years to build? What would we build, and what would the community look like in 100 years, and what would it do? And I think part of the not to lead you too much, but like the part of the conversation we started to have was the notion that in a couple of decades, a number of StartingBloc fellows will be nearing retirement and have been very accomplished in their careers and have a unique ability to help the new StartingBloc fellows. And so I guess a follow-on question would be, how do we be intentional about that?
Whoa. Great question, Joe. 100 years is a really long time, and it is a longer and longer time the more into the future you get, by which I mean change keeps happening faster. Even before history, if you will, like the pace of change keeps increasing, and there have been various technological and social changes in humanity over time, as I understand it, of development of agriculture, development of language, development of agriculture, development of cities then around agriculture, and all sorts of things, and the Industrial Revolution, and information technology, and even if you just look at something like population growth versus like in the span of a human lifetime, the global population has changed more in your or my lifetime than in any other person of our age before now. maybe like slight blips around. No, not even, because I'm thinking percentage-wise or exponential increase. But anyway, like, yeah, it's not been totally monotonic. There have been times where a lot of death has happened, the Black Death, or in Europe, knocked a lot of people down. But change is happening faster and faster, right? So extrapolating out 100 years, I mean, besides the fact that the past has already happened and the future hasn't happened yet, is really hard to do. I've said something so profound, and you can just soak that in. But beyond that, so I think more will change in the next 100 years than has happened in the past 100 years, just as a qualitative balance of if we look at over history, that has usually been true, depending on the time span you measure on either side. Even with that, so then keeping this as a lower bound, if we look at how much has changed in the past 100 years and what entities and institutions still exist that were around then, I think that as an exercise could be instructive, right? To think about, okay, if we want to make something that will still be around in 100 years, which even itself is a premise we could start to question or think about, okay, well, why? What's the intention behind that? And but I don't know. Certain buildings are still here, right? Many buildings. Some things that have made buildings that were seen as good then, good now are certainly a quality of construction. How sturdy is it? I'm sure there are architectural historians who could talk to us about ways that certain design elements have proven useful and sort of appealing to humans, like the fact that mill buildings, which were built in so many New England or around which so many New England towns were built in a certain era, had high ceilings, had large windows, and those were for, I think, functional reasons, usually, like, I don't know if it's let the fumes escape or get airflow, or it's needed to have space for machinery, and it's natural light, then that's less you have to spend on whale oil lamps or whatever it was illuminating the space. Makes them really great for loft apartments when you renovate them. Can we say the same about Walmart boxes? I mean, obviously not the same thing, and it's hard to predict the future. So maybe there are design elements of Walmart stores, not to pick on Walmart, but of any big box store that will be attractive to future humans and extensible and transformable. I have a hard time imagining what they are. That doesn't mean that they're not there. We can have humility about that and our ability to predict the future. But, I mean, at the least, humans like natural light. I feel like that's a thing that has been true for a long time, and it's probably still going to be true in the future. And so tall windows here versus in a box store, there aren't those. So I don't know. So that's one aspect, right? Buildings, and if we extrapolate from this, there may be design principles for not just what are fads, but what seem to be things that the parts of humans that will not change in 100 years will still want and like. That's something. That's like a principle maybe we could bring to this. That brings up another good point, which is, oh my gosh, what will humanity be like in 100 years? How much will we even be made of organic matter, to put it one way? There are already, you could make strong arguments that, I mean, there are cyborgs around. Like, anyone with a pacemaker is part cyborg. Anyone with a prosthetic limb. Anyone with any sort of implant. Contact lenses, even if you can take them out, that's a form of a non-biological substance that is then part of your person and you're walking around with, right? And if you imagine, or just think about how much has changed, even the iPhone came out in 2007, right? 12 years is not a long time in this big picture in the span of things. What's something like this going to look like 12 years from now? I mean, think about how much more. You couldn't copy paste on the original iPhone, right? I can make a video call in high quality to someone halfway around the world with like a little bit of lag. Someone who lives in a rural setting, what's going to be true, what's going to happen with technology 20 years from now, let alone 100 years. Also, meanwhile, by the way, it's easy to look at, or it's one thing to look at kind of peak technology. Like I think about this in terms of medical care and, or just healthcare, sort of health technology, not in the pacemaker sense, but in what is the very best that modern medicine can do versus what is the very long tail of how we are providing healthcare to humanity, how humanity is providing healthcare to itself, right? And just because, like, there will, I think this is where wealth inequality and resource distribution more broadly becomes a factor, not even getting at all political or opining about that yet, but just the future of humanity will be different if we're talking about 1% of 1% or whatever fraction of people who can afford some aspects of technological advancement, how that compares with the long tail and how affordable things then are. And at the beginning, the iPhone was expensive. At the beginning, the Tesla Roadster was a $70,000 car, and very few people bought, and it expanded down the chain, and they're working on, cars for the masses. So these things, it's not that change can't happen and things become more accessible, but depending on how one feels about the sort of limits to growth arguments, and that there are certain things that are, human creativity is not finite maybe, but there are certain resources that are finite and or are practically finite in the sense of at some point they just get so expensive that it's essentially finite. Like once we use up all the mineable, lithium, I don't know anything about lithium mining. Mineable lithium within a mile of the Earth's core, or like that's all accessible. Maybe there are technological improvements, like the equivalent of fracking, which is actually a great case study to consider of technological change. I know I'm kind of off the track here of the original question, and a few tangents, nested parentheses in. But if you looked at natural gas projections in the early 2000s, maybe if you were in the petrochemical industry, and like in the hydrocarbon industry, you knew about this. But certainly when I was studying energy sources in 2004 in college, that was before any natural gas shale field boom, before hydraulic fracturing or fracking was this, like, for all of its environmental challenges and everything else. It is a real technological innovation that happened that allowed extremely vast stretches or quantities of natural gas to be harvested, to be obtained, to be developed in a cost range that the market was willing to bear relative to other energy sources. And I did not know about that in 2005. And I remember hearing a couple years later that natural gas was cheap. And I thought, like, no, that can't be right. I remember natural gas as being kind of like, that was, trending at this dollar. And the price had dropped by more than half in the year that I wasn't looking. Because this, obviously I wasn't in any decision-making capacity around even replacing a boiler in a house with oil or natural gas or anything. But as a young 22-year-old was sideswept by this thing I had not seen coming at all, right? So technological changes and other types of change can happen. Who saw the Arab Spring? Who saw the Me Too movement? Who saw Trump's election? Who saw all sorts of things? Maybe some futurist out there did, but that doesn't mean that these things are predictable, certainly not by us here in these chairs. Which is all to say that I may be giving a long preamble here, but on some level it's impossible. And then what do we do? So therefore we should still try. So how would we build something like that would last 100 years? That would still be there? I like the idea of approaching this question not just in thinking about, you didn't specify whether a physical thing but maybe implicit could be an organizational entity. But there are, if we're using things in a very broad sense, my writer friends, I can think of a couple right now, who hate me for using the word thing so much, including my sister who teaches 5th grade language arts. I'm sorry, Link. If there are things that have lasted 100 years that are not physical, they're not organizations, they're memes. I might not call them that, and certainly not a photo with text on it. But elements of a culture. Their cultural habits. Like, there are all sorts of weird little behaviors. Why does the fork go on the left side and, is that right? And the knife and spoon go on the right? I failed etiquette school. I didn't go to etiquette school. Why is that? There's some reason. Who invented that? Why do we still do it? I don't know. Did they try to make it spread as a thing? Like, why am I wearing this style of clothing, Joe? Who decided plaid is a thing? It was like some village of weavers ended up, they happen to have 2 colors, and they start, why are you wearing plaid too, right? They oh, I guess we'll weave it this way because it's more interesting than just plain blue. We'll do the blue and the off-white that we have, and then it became a pattern, and people started associating people with that village with that, and some others liked it and thought it looked smart and cool. So then, boom, hipsters discovered it in 2011 or something, and then everyone's wearing plaid still, or whatever. Maybe no one was wearing plaid in the 80s, and maybe we'll be wearing head-to-toe plaid in the 2040s. But there's some other styles of fabric and patterns that we're not wearing. So where does that leave us?
Could you bring it back to the organization, the StartingBloc? Could you bring it back to StartingBloc?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I guess I brought all that up to say that if you're trying to have an impact on the way the world is 100 years from now, if that's what we're really talking about, would you rather have an organization, in whatever form organizations take then, that is known as StartingBloc, or would you rather have some sort of impact on the world and what is different, right? I think we might say the different thing. There is a role for continuing institutions, and but I think thinking about why we're doing it can help us understand, and can help us design, in this theoretical sense even, what it is we're trying to build. Why a starting block? Is it the value of having an entity that is convening people who are aligned around certain approaches to leading and changing the world for the better, and providing them with this sort of a curatorial and an impresario role, like that of the producer, the person who coordinates and brings everything together, and then some catalytic action happens and things are different than they would have been before, even though the pieces go out separately. Maybe that's part of it. Is it a thought leadership type aspect? Is it a curating events? I think it's hard for me to imagine how humans will be traveling or not traveling. Will we all be plugged into the matrix and just living in all sorts of rural areas where the sea level rise hasn't happened yet, and there's been a lot of flight out of urban cities into hilly lands near large hydropower sources? Maybe. And also, I don't know, solar fields and other stuff. So maybe there's some useful, without taking 1,000 hours to do this project, right? But I don't know, man. There's a lot to consider. I always like going in depth on things, as you can tell by my responses here too. But in thinking through, what if based on these things plausibly happening, it seems like the world could change in this way, and if that is true, then what would be implications for the kind of organization that is valuable in creating a better world than whatever the one is there, or is then. In a way, this connects to improv, actually, which improv comedy, usually just called improv these days, which I did for a couple years in DC and really liked. And the connection is, this is just an aside, in a great improv scene, you are finding a thing that is unusual or a funny thing, and then running with that and kind of saying, if that is true, then what else is true? And if that thing is true, then what else is true? This also happens in story building. It happens in great sci-fi. Anywhere where there's world building. I really like science fiction. I don't read a ton of it, but I really like it when I do, and I'm trying to get around to reading more. And some of the best, I think, is when there's, and in fantasy too this happens, there's a thing that is different. Magic exists in the world, right? 11-year-old boys can get a letter delivered by Owl that says, hey, you're a wizard, Harry. If that is true, then what else is true? You know what else? The best-selling book series of all time. Maybe that's true or not. The Bible sold a lot of copies too. But anyway, Harry Potter. Or, hey, what if human civilization by the 2300s, the year 2300-ish, has developed interstellar space travel capacity and is like this, Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Starship Enterprise, Star Trek The Next Generation. If that is true, what else is true? And you're going from this premise, and then you just get to explore, right? So the further out you get, the harder it is in some ways. And so it's one thing to write science fiction where it doesn't matter if you're right or not, right? I'm sure there are science fiction authors who are writing partially with the idea that I think science fiction is one of the more powerful tools we have for imagining possible futures. So it can be a tool in that sense, but I think that one way to approach this, which isn't the question you asked, but how do we design a starting block, whatever it is, to be around, and not just around for aroundness sake, but to be meaningful, to be doing something, to be worth it being there and having a positive effect 100 years from now, is to think through, well, what's the premise? What might be different, and then what aspect, and maybe run the exercise a bunch of times, thinking about climate and geography. Okay, what might be true? And if that is true, what else is true? And if that is true, what else is true? And build that out, and then, okay, what would be useful in this setting? And then backcast from that, which is a term we used in grad school a lot, of this idea of backcasting from a desirable future scenario to the present. We can forecast some, but that only tells us trends. You can also look at a possible future scenario and then try to work backwards and say, well, how would we get there from here? So if it's useful, if you think that liquid transportation fuels or energy density is going to be a challenge in the future for transportation, that we'll have enough electricity from solar and wind and electric hydro, but hydrogen cars and whatever else and battery storage is just not going to work out for whatever reason, and that's going to be a limiting factor, then maybe that has implications for transportation and for where people live and for whether or not you should try to have a thing that convenes people physically in person. Or, okay, we're thinking about that for a little. Then if we think about, okay, maybe, and this is all far from starting block in some ways, but so many things relate to that I can take it for anything. How is haptic feedback technology, or not just that, but touch technology essentially going to develop and change in the next 100 years? Let alone pharmacological or psychopharmacologicals. What's the term for brain drugs? I'm thinking about neurotransmitters and how do we meet our need to, there's a lot of value for humans in oxytocin, and touching other humans makes us feel good, to put it one way. For evolutionary reasons we can understand. Again, I'm not an evolutionary scientist. I just like to say, hey, that kind of makes sense, I think. But we have drugs that we take where that's not an issue anymore. So you can really, it's not a problem, and we can get fully mental health and all this just through your iHelm 12. Maybe. Or maybe we won't, or it will have been too expensive, or the profit motive won't have been there, so it won't have been developed, and civilization just trended in other directions, and living in close proximate community groups but otherwise spread out as much as possible will be a thing. So then what does that suggest about, maybe Starting Bloc, there's a real value in having an entity of Starting Bloc, an organization that helps identify and connects people with common interests in maybe it's changing the world for the better and being creative about it and being a community. Maybe it's some other framing or some. I mean, that's my framing, right? But maybe it's something else by then of what the world needs that connects people in some ways or connects their ideas. Or you can go on the virtual reality immersive snap/chat roulette appverse of the future and press the starting block button and you pop into a virtual coffee room or a virtual Jeffersonian dinner with 12 other people you haven't met, but there's a clear structure for it, and that's the Starting Bloc Institute of the day. Is Starting Bloc, the entity, has analyzed and sorted and combined and done the analytics in the ways that you will have the optimal experience and develop best in the most likely way from the conversations you then have. I'm still punting on the question because they're just like too many variables, man. I don't know. It'd be easier to think 20 years ahead, I think, and maybe actually is what that might even be what I advise. That I think there are cases for planning far out. Like I want to say something about that, and London's planning about climate change, including thinking about 150 years and 300 to 400 years, from a conversation I had with a friend who's a meteorologist from the UK. And then I want to talk about I want to talk about completion briefly. Okay. All right, I want to talk about two things. The time frame of planning as a counterpoint to my previous point that I think it'd be easier to plan 20 years instead of 100 years. And maybe, like, not just easier, but maybe more valuable. That also relates to... So from that, I want to talk about, as a counterpoint, an aspect of long-term planning and London and climate change, thinking 150 years, 300 to 400 years. And I want to talk about completion. I have a friend who is he's a weather scientist, a climatologist, but more, I guess, a meteorologist, you'd say. And he is a friend of my British grad school roommate from when we were doing a master's degree in Sweden. And he came to visit once. We became friends, stayed Facebook friends, and he came to DC and crashed on my couch. And we went out to dinner one night, and he was telling me about the city of London and their planning around climate change and other things. And they have, apparently, according to him, circa 2012, whenever this was, they use a 150-year time horizon in their planning around large public works and climate implications and all that. They're thinking that far ahead. And you may have heard of the Thames Barrage, is the name for these giant, I think, multi-billion dollar project. So the Thames River flows through London, gets somewhat tidal, I think, a little farther east, farther out to the English Channel from London, and there's a kind of, this is the hydrological term, a backwash that can happen, right? A tidal backflow. And to prevent that and prevent flooding that apparently would sometimes come along with that, depending on the tides, they built this large series of floodgates all along the Thames River estuary that can be opened and closed at the appropriate time. And this was a giant public works project, if I remember correctly. My friend Chris was saying that if you look out 150 years and different scenarios of sea level rise, they're talking about they may need to build even farther out a much larger, enormous, second set of barrage, I guess it's called. Barrage, I think, is the way he pronounced it. Like we would say garage and I say garage, where you park your car, but this is a barrage, if I remember correctly. Anyway, much larger, like billions of pounds farther out, because sea level rise will happen so much, and I forget if it's would expand beyond the boundaries of or just overwhelm the existing one. But he was saying if you look out through various other factors in the different models, 300, 400 years, in certain possible scenarios, depending on how things shake out and all sorts of, Greenland and the glaciers and Antarctica and all that, it is possible that, and maybe even likely, I don't know, and climate science has kept on improving, there's a good likelihood that it will rise, sea levels will rise further and high enough that no size of gate can be effective because the groundwater level has risen so much along with sea level then that just the foundations of London are soaked. And skyscrapers can't sit, and certain things that rely on dry foundation cannot exist on wet, and flooding just happens literally from the ground up. So there is value in looking ahead beyond. If you say 150 years, great, come on, you got to give us a lot of credit, which yeah, I give them a lot of credit. But to me, and I may, have details of the story wrong or whatever, but it was illustrative of there can be real value in thinking ahead, not just ahead. If there are things that you can predict or at least see some likelihood for, and we could get into probability and black swan events and what a professor of mine in college talked about as the concept of gambler's ruin, which is that no matter in addition to the likelihood and the statistical likelihood of certain events of you win some, you lose some, whatever, in the thought experiment of a gambler, and even if the odds are in your favor, you need to be able to play the game enough times and have the cash flow to be able to get that odds. And there's going to be a random walk in that, and in the long term, on average, it works out bell curve wise to 51% odds in your favor, whatever. But if you run out of money on a downswing, you're out of money. And I think there are certain analogies there for planning too. But I think I'm getting off topic now.
Well, I think maybe you can talk more about this, but there are, you described things, and probably making those writing teachers more angry now. But the in terms of the built environment, it makes sense in what you're describing because things have life cycles, right? Mm-hmm. So infrastructure, it would make sense that we would look out and understand that every 30 to 50 years, we're going to have to make a kind of renewing capital investment. But I don't know. I wonder. I like what you're saying about futurism. I wonder if, I don't know if this is where you were going with completion, but I don't know if we should talk about that now or if.
I think we should talk about that now because you just gave a great segue that I wasn't even thinking about to this idea of completion. So I think about how I want to start this. Let me stop this chart. There we go. Completion. In thinking about planning, and I just told the story of the value of thinking 300 to 400 years ahead based on the best climate models we can calculate now rather than just 150 years, and the implications for London as even a city that is able to exist in that location, for example. There are also, Houston Spencer, who used to speak at StartingBloc pretty often. I don't know if he came up with this concept or this framework, but I associate it with him of this idea of hubris and humility are essential for the work of trying to change the world. That you need the hubris, the overconfidence to dare to try. Who the heck do you think you are? That you, one person, can make a dent in the universe, as Seth Godin I think I've heard say. So you need to be pretty, have some pride there and some maybe some bluster or some just pretty strong confidence in yourself. And you also need humility to be successful, and to realize that you are not the first person who has tried to change things. And there may, in fact, be others you can learn from, even others who weren't successful, or weren't successful in a way that you want to see yourself being successful. So hubris and humility, a nice pairing. And there's a humility here that I'm thinking of in our ability to predict or plan long term. And one example that comes to mind is the Erie Canal, as far as infrastructure investments, which happened to run about a mile south of where I went to college in Rochester, New York. And there's a great park designed by Olmsted's firm at the intersection of the Genesee River and the Erie Canal, and you can bike over the bridges between them. The Erie Canal was, I remember learning a song in elementary school here in Massachusetts, the 15 miles on the Erie Canal. I've got a mule, her name is Sal, 15 miles on the Erie Canal. She's a good old worker and a good old pal. 15 miles on the Erie Canal. Just one more day and back we'll go, through the rain and sleet and snow, 'cause we'll know every inch of the way from Albany to Buffalo. I remember all this. Anyway, there's a chorus then. The Erie Canal was dug between, I guess, from Albany to Buffalo. Great idea. Canal connecting the Great Lakes, Buffalo was on Lake Erie, to the Hudson River down to the East Coast. Brilliant. Awesome. There are, I forget how many, 57 or something, many locks along the way because of the change in elevation and all that. And they dug it and they built it, and a mule named Sal may have had a role to play. And if I remember correctly, literally within a decade of the canal, it took a little while to build. Within a decade of it being completed, you know what happened? Railroads. And specifically, railroads along that route, making it pretty much obsolete. And not completely obsolete, like you still take boats, but if you can ship or can transport things a lot faster and maybe even cheaper along the same route, it doesn't matter how much money you spent on the Erie Canal, you're not going to recoup that investment, or someone's going to be out a lot of money, you know? I also feel bad for anyone who owned a taxi medallion in New York City from before the time of Uber and Lyft to now, you know? So I guess that's all to say that, and you know, there are plenty of examples of Greek temples, and pick literally any ruin, and how long did the founders think that would last? Right? There are plenty of examples. There are also examples of creative reuse, and you know, we're in a house that was built in 1805, and I'm pretty sure Charles Payne, the guy who commissioned it and hired Thomas Paine, somebody Payne, hired Charles Bulfinch, the architect, to design it, did not have in mind that we would be creating some kind of motion picture technology. Oh wait, that didn't exist at all, even in the conception. There was no zoetrope or anything, and be talking about the fact that God doesn't exist, and social change strategy about the world, and the climate changing, and all these things, right? So anyway, I was going to talk about completion, so let's talk about that. I heard a lovely use of the term completion maybe about a year ago from my friend Katie Gordon that I've thought about a lot since, which is she's done a lot of work with, she's part of a project called Nuns and Nuns, one spelled N-U-N-S, like in a habit, and one spelled N-O-N-E-S, like the checkbox on a form when you're asked, what is your religion? And you check none of the above. So Nuns and Nuns brings together women religious, especially Catholic sisters, nuns, right? and millennials who would self-identify as either non-religious or atheist, agnostic, or not fitting into any of the other boxes, they bring them together for gatherings of sharing and relationship and community, and it's doing some really cool stuff. And Katie told me that the term for when an order of, they're called women religious sometimes as a noun, or of Catholic sisters, when an order, on a certain community of nuns, when the last member dies, the community closes, the term for that is that it has come to completion. The order has come to completion, or the group has come. And for whatever reason, that really struck me. It's not that it died. It's not that it ended even. I mean, those are also true, fair things that we could say. But the term that is generally used, it has come to completion. It had a purpose. It did its thing. And hey, guess what? It is now completed. It's done. It's like, in a way, there's almost a feeling of intentionality around that, although or an echo of that, although it's really not intentional, I imagine in most cases. But I've been enjoying thinking about that in the context of, and that idea of completion in that sense, in the context of other things in life, other aspects of life, whether it's an organization, whether it's a philanthropic foundation, whether it's a pop-up restaurant, I don't know, whatever, coming to a close. And thinking about that as, or whether it's a life, right? Coming to completion. I think our culture, our society, modern, Western, whatever, white culture in all its problematic ways, whatever dimensions of our culture you want to self-identify as and take with it, I think, and speaking for myself, is pretty bad at talking about death. And by bad at, I mean we shy away from it. It's uncomfortable. It's for understandable reasons in many, right? I don't mean to be wailing on this, but and that's both true, I think, at an individual level and at an organizational level. And I've started to hear occasionally little bits of I think there's a restaurant open in Boston right now that is open, might be ramen. I saw just a newspaper headline about it. That's open for 1,000 nights and then will close. And they decided right from the start it will close. And I've heard of foundations that rather than trying to only spend the interest and dividends or whatever to maintain their capital base or even grow their capital over time, are spending down their foundation money with the goal of fully using it up and, whether or not they're using this term, coming to completion at a certain time. And, we're all going to die someday. Even if Ray Kurzweil succeeds in uploading his consciousness to an AI or something, the physical body will go, which is hard to think about. And this is one area I think some religious traditions have to offer. I think there's a lot of what I might call, maybe uncharitably, magical thinking and wishful thinking around death in a lot of religious traditions that I can also understand because it makes it a lot easier to deal with if you think it's not final, if there's an afterlife. But I think traditions and rituals around mourning help with that, and reflecting on the value of a life and what we can learn from that. And I think the same could be done for organizations, for projects, for other things. I don't know if anyone ever did that for the Erie Canal. It just occurs to me now that organizations do sometimes use the term post-mortem for a project ended and let's talk about it. I think it's maybe there's a different tone to those conversations maybe, but in a way there's maybe even an analogy here to the current second wave of trend around Marie Kondo and her KonMari method, which the book came out a few years ago and the Netflix show just came out, where you're asking, does this thing spark joy? And if it doesn't spark joy, it doesn't mean it's trash. I mean, it does mean it's bad for the trash. It doesn't mean that it's worthless. It means you can thank it for its service and for what it brought to your life and release it. And maybe the connection of you with that shirt, that I'm not going to say community, because that's not, but that pairing has come to completion. And you know what? It can be let go. And I think there are lessons in that for all sorts of things, for community, for communities, certainly for our own mortality and thoughts about that, and maybe for planning for the future too. And certainly, I mean, as a board member of StartingBloc too, I'm not advocating for it to come to completion anytime soon. I think there's a lot of good and a lot of useful and maybe even necessary work that it is doing and can do in the world, and I want to help it continue to do that and do more of it. And you know, the friend's house too. Maybe there will be a time. I mean, at some point there will be a time that it comes to completion. Heat death of the universe, if you want to go that far into the future, right? The sun gets so large and becomes a red giant, and its radius is past where we are. Runaway climate change, and Boston's underwater 300 years from now, if models go a certain way. We're on a hill, actually, but you know, it's just no one wants to live here anymore, and it crumbles apart, right? These things will not happen in our lifetime, probably, but they will happen at some point. And this kind of gets into philosophy, maybe, which I'm not a philosopher and I've never studied it, but I don't know, on some level, because it will happen, I want to say, like, it's okay if it's unavoidable at some time. We can still work to prevent that and still work to do a lot of things in the meantime. And this is leading me back to, maybe get just back to the question of why are we doing writing teachers, the thing, right? Whatever it is what we're working on, what is the reason behind it? And again, asking that intention, what is the purpose behind? And what is the purpose behind hoping that StartingBloc exists in 100 years or in 20 years? What is the purpose behind the friend's house? Or what is the purpose behind, not to get too life coachy, but behind one's own life and what one wants to do with one's career, with one's being in the world and the way one interacts with others. You know, what do you want to bring? To quote, this is a nice way to end this on, to quote the recently passed Mary Oliver, one of her most famous lines, wonderful poet, right? Wrote a lot about nature and poetry, really inspired by it. But this line of something like, what is it you will do with your one wild and precious life? And to quote Gandalf, all we can do is decide what to do with the time that is given to us.